So today I've decided to reflect on a bit of personal history here as I dwell into Microsoft Arcade for Windows 3.1. This is one of the few games where I still have from the old 486 days back in the 90s, and was one of my first exposure to some arcade classics that, up until that point at least, I have either never played or only played through lesser interpretations such as the Atari 2600 versions. Since I was in a mood for something nostalgic, I rummaged through my old floppy archives and pulled out the old floppy disk version of Microsoft Arcade from the pack, and decided to fire it up for old time's sake. I wasn't sure if it was going to be working, but fortunately not only does my copy of the game still work, but works extremely well under the Windows XP platform. Could this work under the current Windows platform that's being supported today? I don't know. I don't have Windows 8 or 7. Sure as hell don't have Vista, but I digress. Microsoft Arcade contains 5 classic Atari arcade games: Tempest, Battlezone, Asteroids, Centipede, and Missile Command. All of them are based on their original arcade counterparts, so almost exactly. Actually, the funny thing about Microsoft Arcade is that the 5 games featured aren't emulated. It's not like MAME where you pop in a ROM and you click on it and it runs just like you remember it. Rather, these things were rebuilt from the ground up and made to replicate the arcade experience as close as humanly possible. And for something that was rewritten from scratch, the designers did an incredible job with games in these collections. Almost as if I'm playing the real deal themselves, except with a keyboard and mouse instead of a joystick and trackball. So let's look at each of these games, shall we? Asteroids, the original vector-based space shooter where you're blowing away space rocks. Sounds close enough to the arcade original and maintains a rather consistent pace throughout. The vector-based graphics are recreated to near perfection, controls spot on, can't complain all that much. Well, there were brief instances where my shots would pass through small asteroids without blowing them up, but those instances are very brief and doesn't kill the game outright, so yeah, Asteroids done well. Can't argue with that. Battlezone, the original vector-based tank shooter where you drive a tank around to blow up other tanks and other things of that nature. Despite the understandably sluggish nature of the game, you're driving a tank after all, Battlezone plays remarkably well and looks absolutely brilliant even more than 3 decades after its original inception. And this Windows interpretation is just as slick to control with the number pad controlling movement and spacebar to fire your main gun. Very solid game overall and very solid conversion. Centipede, the original worm-busting arcade classic. While the original arcade game used a trackball to control the player's gun, this version uses the mouse, which is just about as good a substitute for the trackball as you can get. Even with an optical-based mouse that wasn't even invented when this compilation first came out, it works brilliantly well and without fail, feeling much more natural than the somewhat stiff controls of a digital pad or joystick. Overall, not a bad conversion of Centipede, plays really well and quite a bit of fun actually. Missile Command, the original missile defense game, or something. Anyway, you defend against missiles using the mouse as your targeting cursor and the A, S, and D keys assuming command of your turrets. Plays well enough, but I'm absolutely brutal at Missile Command, especially when there's a dog on my lap struggling to lick my table. Don't ask. And finally we have Tempest, the original tube shooter long before Tempest 2000 plus X3 or any other weird ass variation I might be missing. Your claw is controlled with the mouse, which feels fine for the most part, but tends to be an issue when it's on top of the tube and controls are inverted as a result. Other than that though, plays well enough and it's a frantic game to boot. And those are the 5 games of Microsoft Arcade. There's not much to it, they play the same way as you remember them, only with different control inputs, obviously. And there's minor extra stuff that you could tweak for each game, such as the controls and various details of the gameplay to make it easier or harder than the default settings. For example, you can control the speed of your tank in Battlezone and things of that nature. There's even a help file for each game, which is rather nice if you want to learn how to play each game. There's a couple downsides, sure. For one, there's no gamepad support, which is a bummer if you want to relive some Battlezone action with a controller, but the keyboard and mouse setup works so well here that I don't actually mind the missing compatibility with a gamepad. The other significant downside is the lack of proper full screen support. There is a full screen option in this compilation, But all this does is make the playfield only slightly bigger and surrounded with a grayish border while removing the Windows menu. Mind you, for something that's only a few inches away from you, it's just fine, and I doubt anyone would consider having the foresight to design a visual mode that will fit in nicely with your futuristic TV thing while you're sitting on your couch. But it would have been nice if the playfield could at least fill the height of the screen. No need to stretch it to fill the whole screen or anything, because then it would look ugly. Just the height, something like that, but again, it's not that big of a deal. Honestly, all minor issues aside, Microsoft Arcade is a really nice compilation of arcade classics for Windows that still plays efficiently well today, considering these are not emulated ROMs but rather programs rebuilt from the ground up to replicate and recreate the arcade games as originally presented way back when. The end result is almost on par with the arcade originals that almost comes off as a near perfect experience replicated on the Windows 3.1 platform. However, as good as it has held up over the years, and as much as I enjoy this oldie but goodie, Microsoft Arcade is something of a hard sell for most folks, as there are other classic compilations that are not only more plentiful in regards to quantity, but I'm pretty sure most of them don't come on floppy disks like this one does. After all, how many people still use floppy disks in this day and age? Quite honestly, the answer is not the majority. And then of course, you know, when it comes to these sort of things, there's always that emulation card that some folks likes to put out, but I'm not touching that one. Bottom line, Microsoft Arcade is a solid package with 5 perfectly replicated arcade classics that can be found for pretty cheap if you look hard enough. For a novelty item, it's not a bad pickup, and there's quite a bit of fun to be had here. And I'll just leave it at that. Good night.